Hello, everybody, and welcome to LinkedIn Live. This week, I've got Gary Wang, who's the Senior Product Marketing Manager for A10 for our ThreatX platform. Welcome, Gary.
Hello, hello. See, there was almost a stumble, but not quite.
Today, we're going to talk about the difference between traditional WAFs and next-gen WAFs and some of the challenges that folks face around it. I think I'll just start off maybe with my experience and having been a practitioner and a pen tester and other things. My knowledge of most traditional WAFs is they're based on an old technology called mod security. And mod security is a regex-based way to catch attacks. Most security tools, at least legacy tools, have a tendency to target a single transaction. So, for example, if you understand the way websites work, what your browser does for you is it creates a string that is what's called a get statement, and you will send that to the web server, and then that get statement gets translated into a command set, and from that you are given information back. Traditional WAFs look at that statement for whether it's good or bad. Does it contain malicious content? Does it ask for something it shouldn't ask for? But unfortunately, when we do that with regex, we need one for every time or every statement that someone makes to the web server. And what it really leads to is a tremendous amount of rules, very complex rule sets and overlapping rules, and a tremendous amount of overhead and management. And the net result, in my experience, has been most people don't run their WAFs in blocking mode. Gary, I don't know what you've seen around that, but maybe share some of your experience.
That was a very good summary. So maybe I'll touch on a few things. The first thing that stuck out to me was Jamison, when you talked about regex. So that stands for regular expressions, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that. And essentially, it's kind of the simple idea that, so let's say if I give someone a simple command, and their command is to stop, let's say stop Gary. Okay, this is like an example I like to use when explaining regular expressions. Normally, regular expressions, they are a bit smaller than simple rule-based, right? So for those of you who are familiar with Excel, there's something called a VLOOKUP. So if you search it for Gary, it will literally search for Gary in all lower caps, unless you give it rules. So that's where regular expression comes in. If you use that, you can capture different versions of the name Gary. So, some of you maybe spell it Gary, maybe Geary. It can stop all that. But all of this is regular expressions. And like Jamison was saying, because what we're trying to stop is it's almost like phrases. You're trying to stop general things from happening. So for regular expressions, you end up having a ton of them. So very often with my experience of working with WAFs, talking about WAFs, talking with others about it, it is what Jamison talked about. Because there are so many false positives, it can be very difficult to stop something if you have that many rules. Not only is it slower because it's got to go through all that, but more importantly, you end up with a lot of false alerts, because then you try to block something, it shouldn't necessarily be blocked. And as a result, I'll take it one step further. There are some people who say they straight up turn off their WAF. They get it for compliance, but they don't actually even use it. So that's definitely a big concern for WAFs.
Yeah, that's a lot of wasted money, right? That we have a limited security budget and a lot to do. And to have tools that are turned off is not nearly as effective. And I would say this problem actually is amplified now with Gen AI. As a pen tester, we used to look for as many ways to create a phrase that would cause an interaction as we could. So for example, if I'm doing cross-site scripting, there are many ways to cross-site script. There's not just one. And so they have to have a rule for every time it happens.
Yeah.
And with Gen AI, I can actually now go in and say, using this code example, write me 100 iterations of it. And then use that as cross-site scripting. So really, Gary, let's transition a little bit and tell me a little bit about what are some of the modern ways to stop these sorts of things that don't use regex? What's the future here?
Yeah. Okay. So this is perfect timing, because you're talking about cross-site scripting. I'll actually use two to kind of explain. So there's SQL injection, and there's also cross-site scripting. I would say both of these are very well known. So SQL is the database language you use to pull data from databases. And then for cross-site scripting, I believe that tends to resemble more of JavaScript. So it's really important to talk about these two differences, because instead of using regular expressions now, one of the more, let's call it advanced ways, is people try to tokenize this language. Tokenizing is essentially assigning a variable to a value. So with the example I used earlier, right? If I was an attacker and I wanted to trick this system is able to block variations of Gary. If I'm trying to obfuscate or basically try to hide my attack, I would say X equals Gary and then put X in there. So as an example, if like you and me, Jamison, if we're talking, if I told you, hey, Jamison, from now on in our conversation, every time I say X, that means Gary. You and I will know that, but a machine may not be able to notice that. So back to the idea of tokenizing, that's kind of the way that defenders are now, I'm generalizing as one of the ways they can tokenize these requests. So I brought up SQL injection versus cross-site scripting, because JavaScript is a very loose language. There's a lot of stuff you can do in there. So as a result, it's a lot more difficult to tokenize versus SQL. It's a lot more restricted. So people generally have found more success with tokenizing the SQL language versus cross-site scripting.
That's good. So one of the things I also encounter a lot as a pen tester, and I think AI has really helped me amplify this, is my ability to use legitimate commands or probing type commands that come from different places or do it over time. And what I mean by that is traditionally a WAF looks at every individual transaction individually. So a single get command, is this get command good or bad? Is the next get command good or bad? It's a single sort of individual approach. And because of that, I have the opportunity to do a number of things in a row, and it doesn't understand that I'm the same actor doing that.
Yeah. Okay, so I think what you're referring to is there is an idea. There's a difference between, so what you're kind of talking about is like transaction-based tracking, right? So we look at the transaction itself. Something else that could help with that is the idea of entity-based tracking. A very simple way that I kind of like to think about this is, if let's say you have a WAF in place, usually to simplify, I would think, okay, this action is bad. So there's a certain action that I'm looking for. There is another mindset, which we talked about, would be like entity-based tracking, is we say this user is bad. Both of them potentially have shortcomings, because if let's say you are if you go with the user approach, right? If you only track by users, just because I have done something bad once or twice doesn't mean that I am going to do something bad every single time. And then if we track based off of transactions, that could be very much a whack-a-mole situation. It's like, oh, I see a transaction, let me stop that. Oh, I see another one, let me stop that. So I feel like the next level to that, when you start to blend the two of these together, right? So first, before we get to the final level, I would say there starts to be people who will do things like, okay, this type of user, if this type of user is doing this type of action, that could be bad. Then to get more advanced, it would become, if this type of user between these hours of the day from X location are doing this type of action during these hours of the day from these kind of locations, it starts to get more and more in advance, and it starts to get more and more accurate with these statements that you make. Does that kind of make sense?
It does. It seems like that approach also might really help with, I guess, what I would call modern DDoS. Everybody's familiar with layer 3, layer 4,
Yes.
traditional avalanches, but layer 7 DDoS is sort of the brave new world of attackers. And just for anybody who doesn't know what a layer 7 DDoS is, there's multiple ways to do it. I could, for example, if I know a web page on your site is particularly taxing, this one requires a lot of database backend, image rendering, all sorts of things that would make it more expensive to render than other pages. I could request that web page, which is a perfectly valid thing to do, from a million bots all at the same time. Could cause your CPU to spike. few other examples might be if you have a submit in your page where you take data back from the user, I can leak that data back to you very slowly inside your TCP timeout window so that the socket remains open the entire time. And then I just keep doing that. There's nothing illegal or wrong or seemingly malicious for doing this sort of a thing. But a solo LoRa's attack like that is resource intensive, ties up all your sockets. Pretty soon the website starves. So when we think about these layer 7 attacks, they're incredibly difficult to detect because they're legitimate traffic used in a malicious way. So how does this approach help us stop that sort of stuff, Gary?
With what you just talked about for you're talking about slow and low attacks for application layer DDoS attacks. So if we tie it back to this idea of entity and also having transaction-based tracking, right? Okay, so this is kind of an interesting topic because when it gets to layer 7 application, if you notice the two types of attacks that you talked about, right? There's slow and low, and you kind of talked about the flooding attacks. That is actually very similar to the layer 3, layer 4 attacks we talked about, but now it's in layer 7. Before I go to talking about the entity base, I wanted to add in a quick note, which is it's important to distinguish between application layer DDoS attacks and layer 3 and 4 attacks. One of the biggest reasons being when it gets into the application layer, you have to decrypt the packet in order to look inside. Because before that, I believe for solutions that are mostly layer 3 or 4, they might use techniques like TCP progression or tracking to try and get some insight, but they never get to look inside the envelope. So now let's go back to talking about these types of how do we distinguish? Well, if we're trying to distinguish between these types of DDoS attacks, knowing what entity is doing this, right? So normally if you have, let's say a block list, right? And what are you doing? You're stopping the user because you're going by, oh, these IPs usually execute DDoS attacks, therefore we should block them. But at the same time, looking into the behavior and the ones you talked about, that's basically going into business logic because you're saying they look legitimate, right? If they look legitimate, how do we know the transaction is necessarily bad? So because they look legitimate, now we have to consider who is doing this. And if their behavior is mimicking a legitimate one, there should be other factors within that tell us like, wait, is this actual real? So the bot space is big for this as well, right? Let's say there's something like a CAPTCHA. So those annoying things you got to click through, right? One of the funny things about this is you actually don't want to do it too quickly. Because if you do too quickly, it's very clear that a bot filled out this CAPTCHA. Versus if you take there's a window of time that's like humanly possible. So I'd say that's why like there's all these extra checks that go in that are related to the user and the transaction now.
That's a really interesting, Gary. I think on the same front though, you said business logic, and no doubt that becomes a huge factor, especially around bot and click-throughs. But for me, I've experienced the most sort of business logic exploitation, whatever, around APIs, because typically headless systems, APIs, are me and third-party vendors, maybe downstream, upstream, whatever, that we are servicing something back and forth, whether it be financial information, shipping information, inventory, right? These are all just business level problems, and typically those commands are not well understood by a WAF, for example, because it's looking again for that transaction. Is it good or bad? Even if it's looking at for entity, it's still not quite there because I have to understand more context without having context, right? In a typical HTTP packet, I can learn a great deal about what's happening or what's been requested almost in plain text usually. Like I can, I don't have to be too much of a programmer to understand it. And as I become more of a programmer, I understand it all. But boy, an API command can be 30 characters and contain some cryptic language that is incredibly powerful. I'll just give you an example, and then we can talk about, how this can become addressed. But I used to be part of a retail website that had huge surges at holidays, right? Christmas and, Valentine's Day specifically, and things like that. And we experienced an attack where the shopping cart was tied to our inventory system. So you would go in and say, I'm
Yeah,
going to buy
where this is
this,
going.
this thing for my girlfriend. And, cause it's going to be Valentine's Day and I want to get this done. So they would go in and drop inventory into the carts, removing it from legitimate customers, and
Uh,
then abandon the carts. And we had to go through the timeout for that in order for it to be put back in inventory.
yeah.
Right. And so that was a business logic attack where they could tie up our resources. So how do we tie these ideas of entity and non-entity based tracking, behavioral understanding to a business logic attack of that level, which is
Mhm.
both sophisticated and not? Right? It's ultimately very simple. I mean, I can actually do it. I can just click. I
Mhm.
don't, I don't even really have to do it
Yeah.
programmatically, right? So how do we tie those things together for let's say, just to maybe bring it to a modern metaphor? Taylor Swift's tour was crushed by
Yeah.
bots buying tickets. Right.
Yep.
Same thing with PlayStation. When the PlayStation 5 came out, Sony experienced an incredible surge of people buying up PlayStations, thousands of them, and then reselling them on the black market for 2 or 3 or 4x what their retail price was.
Yeah.
Yeah. How
You
do we
know,
use those technologies to understand those sorts of business logic attacks?
yeah. So the last one, the Taylor Swift one, I believe those are like scalping attacks. That's one of the ways, right? They just buy up all the tickets. Or I really like the one you gave earlier when he said shopping cart inventory. I'm like, ooh, I think I've heard of this story before. So to your question of what can we do nowadays to try and stop this? I don't have the greatest answer to be honest, but I can give a broader answer as to generally how are we going about it. Because ultimately, what this breaks down to is there's a human behavior, right? So if we ask a human, is this legitimate? A human will know. And I feel like the goal constantly now is to create this black box, which I call it black box because basically it is AI, it is machine learning, but no one is allowed to share what algorithms they're actually using or what their decision tree looks like. So it's basically a black box, but it's almost like a race to create a black box that can function the way that a human is functioning. So when we look at the idea of business logic, right? I think business logic really is one of the trickiest ones because that's where someone with malicious intentions is trying to do everything that it looks as legit as possible, right? Like in gaming terms, why business logic is so scary. There's a difference between what do they call it, a glitch and like a break in the game or something like, or a glitch and an intended misuse of some like function in a game. That's what business logic is. It's you're using something that was you are maliciously using something that was intended. So, like you said, for the shopping cart, you're not breaking any rules. So, how would you try and stop that? Right now, what I see a lot of solutions doing is they're actually looking a little bit into what I would define as threat intelligence. So, they're doing, for example, behavior baselining, behavior learning. And then what do they do with all this information? They collect it and they start to build these like dynamic profiles that have adaptive risk scores. So I'm using all these like words, right? But it's actually very simple. A dynamic profile just means my profile for what is an attacker is constantly evolving. There's like more and more variables that get into it. So when you have more and more variables, essentially if it's like a regression model, it becomes more accurate. Then on top of that, what you're looking at is historical trends. That's another one, right? More times someone has done something bad, the more likely they are going to continue committing these malicious acts. So you add in all of these things and you have this dynamic profile that's always evolving. And then on top of that, with the risk score, so that's about like who, right? So let's talk about it as this is the entity based part. Then for the transaction based, right? You start to look at all these transactions that are happening and you start to look for patterns. So there's general sort of behavior that seems to mimic it. You combine these two together and that's why people generally try and use like what they call a risk score. So the action they have done a certain amount of things, that score gets high enough above a threshold, it means you have to block it. Yeah, I kind of like went here or there a lot, but
No, I
that's
think that was a great
kind of what I got.
explanation, Gary. It's maybe it's the only time that profiling is considered okay in our society.
Yes. Okay, that's like a funny way of looking because there's a lot of stuff about profiling, right? But it's funny because that's kind of what we're doing in this defensive
Yes.
space is we're creating profiles.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we just have a little bit of time left, and sort of what I want to tie into now, though, is the idea that we've got uh, traditional web attacks and website securities. We've added a layer with API in
Mhm.
headless systems. And just in case we didn't underscore, one of the problems with API security is I can't ask them to log in. It's not a person, it's headless. So when I
Mhm.
make those transactions downstream, for example, if I'm interacting with FedEx to give shipping information to my customers, there's no authentication mechanism here. There's no CAPTCHA. There's no logins, right? So that becomes difficult as well. And then further, we complicated it with bots who are now doing some legitimate things. I want Google spots to capture my SEO and
Yeah.
promote my website. I may not want OpenAI's bots to scrape all my data and load it into its junky engine. And then I have other bots doing scams and advertising and all sorts of things like that. And I think, just sort of as a closing note, what I've noticed is everybody has a different solution for all of these things, right? So the WAF isn't talking to the API system. The API system isn't talking to the bot system, which isn't talking to the DDoS system. They're all disconnected, 4 different vendors, 4 different consoles, and we're still following the magical search for Camelot, which is what I call the sim, right? Everybody said, we'll stitch it together in the sim and it'll be a perfect world. And it has literally never happened.
Yeah.
Because you just pile trash into the sim and then hope you can make sense out of it. So
Mhm.
really, to me, it seems like all these things are tied together in a way. The attacker is likely to use any of these mechanisms to try to get in, or all at once. How do we bring these things together to create a little bit better vision of what's really
Mhm.
happening to us on the internet?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. With kind of what you're talking about, right? For everyone who's listening to this, you kind of talked about you're talking about the WAF, you're talking about the bot, talking about the API, right? Talking about the DDoS. There is a common thread amongst all of this, which is almost most of these attacks are targeting either the applications or the APIs. So therefore, instead of looking at it as I need this piece to protect this, try and look at what the end goal is, right? And if the end goal is web apps and APIs, therefore it kind of makes sense if you have a consolidated platform. So if you have a consolidated platform solution that is aimed to target these parts, right? So these can all work together. Because it's not like as if a bot goes by itself. If a botnet is trying to attack, it could also be attacking the APIs. It doesn't have to only attack applications. So everything is tied in together. So with that being said, one of the funny things that I kind of look at it as is there's kind of like different levels to the game, let's say. All right. So if there's someone new to the game, we'll call it level 0. They're kind of like, oh my gosh, I have to protect stuff. So hopefully there's not many of those anymore. I know, like, 10 years ago, I mean, even 5 years ago, there's people who are like, security, why? People now know we need security. So there's not many level 0 people left. But if we go to level 1, right, it's kind of like the shopping person. They just go, oh, I want this. They grab that. They want this. Oh, I want bot. I grab that. I want WAF. I grab that. Then I would say like the next level above that would probably be those people who say, hey, buy our solution, toss it in your environment, and it'll work. Right. So they give you the black boxy answer. And that's what a lot of they're like, oh, this is what is it? Hands off. You don't have to manage this. Just turn it on and blah blah blah. But a lot of those solutions I've noticed, they only give you like the products. They don't have like a way to help you with the reporting to help you understand what's happening. It's kind of like, if someone tells me I have a security issue, like, hey, I got this dog. If you just throw it in your front yard, it'll fix everything for you. And I'll go, really? It'll like answer the mail, answer the door, and all that. Like, yeah, don't worry about it. The dog will take care of it. Which, it's like, okay, I'm just gonna put my life in your hands. Then there's a new level that's coming out now, which it's basically the idea of a fully managed SOC that comes along with it. So now what it is what are we on, like level 2 now or level 3? Level 3 now. So the level 3 now would be, okay, you sell me this whole suite of products that works together, right? That's still key. That's a carryover from level 2. But now there's also a fully managed SOC that comes along with it, which means they will manage the solution for me and they will inform me about what it is they are doing. So I think think this last step is an important transition moving forward, because in the past, it's like you get all the products. Okay, if it works, it's great. But if it doesn't, you have no idea what the product is even doing. But at least if they provide this expertise now, what people are calling it nowadays is protection as a service, not only are they supplying you with the hardware or the software necessary, they're also giving you some insight into the expertise they had. So I know that was a little bit long, but that's kind of like, I would say that's kind of what's happening in this space now. And it's a really good move. Now people are starting to understand it better.
Yeah, Gary, it seems like it's, in closing, I would say, it seems like it's something that most CISOs I talk to feel like they can't purchase, which is time and people. Right? Every CISO I talk to says there's 4 things that wake them up at night: revenue, time, people, and then risk last. And so many vendors are trying to sell risk and risk reduction, when the truth is, if I just had more time and people, that I'd be better off. So it seems like this security as a service, this protection as a service, is really about giving people expertise from people who do this every day, all day, and then allowing the teams to have more time back to do more interesting things, then figure out if that alert was valid or not valid.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. The 4 you talked about, because time and money, that's what people complain about all the time, right? Time, that's what everyone talks about, false positives. And then for the people, everyone's like, oh, my security team is too small. Or like, we might not have the expertise to learn how to, right? People always complain about the UIs of products and saying like, oh, this product's too hard to use. That's a good summary of it.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, Gary. I think we're about out of time. Look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thanks for having me.